In the quiet town of Barrywood, nestled among the rolling hills of Massachusetts, life moved at a gentle, predictable pace. It was a place where everyone knew one another, and the local St. Lucas's church stood proudly at the town's heart, not just as a house of worship, but as the cornerstone of community life. Here, the townsfolk gathered to seek comfort, celebrate milestones, and listen to the wisdom of Father David McCollins. Father David had been the town's spiritual shepherd for over a decade. Known for his eloquence and unwavering convictions, he was a man whose counsel carried weight in both personal and communal matters. His words often brought clarity, his guidance shaping the lives of many, yet behind his aura of certainty lay a rigid belief in his unerring judgment, an outlook that would soon embroil him in a scandal so profound it would reverberate through every corner of Barrywood, threatening to unravel the very fabric of its tranquil existence. Mona Peterson, a 30-year-old woman with a heart as generous as her smile, was the embodiment of selflessness in the close-knit town of Barrywood. Known and loved by all, she spent her days organizing Sunday lessons for children, assisting the elderly with their daily needs, and lending a helping hand to anyone in trouble. Mona's bright smile and warm, compassionate eyes were a beacon of kindness, making her a cherished presence within the community. Yet no one could have foreseen that within the sacred walls of St. Lucas's church, a place steeped in prayers, hopes, and faith, a moment would arise so shocking and harrowing that it would shatter the town's tranquil facade. The event would force the people of Barrywood to confront questions of life and death, and the nature of good and evil, in ways they never imagined possible. A cold autumn wind swept through Barrywood, scattering the last clinging leaves from the trees. On the surface, it seemed like any other day. The market hummed with activity, children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard, and the toll of church bells carried through the quiet, winding streets. Yet something was undeniably amiss. There was a tension in the air, subtle but unyielding, as though the town itself could sense the storm of revelations about to descend. Nature, it seemed, was whispering a warning of the chaos to come. In the early morning hours, as Barrywood slowly stirred to life, Lisa Carter approached the door of St. Lucas's church, her knock hesitant but familiar. She had come, as she did every Sunday, to assist Father David in preparing for the service. Normally, Mona would already be there, her gentle presence evident in the freshly arranged flowers or the glow of newly lit candles. But today, the church greeted Lisa with an unsettling stillness, a silence that seemed to stretch across the empty pews and mute the light filtering through the stained glass windows. Lisa called out for Mona, her voice reverberating through the cavernous hall, but there was no reply. At first, she dismissed it as a minor delay. Mona was always reliable after all. Yet as the moments passed, an inexplicable unease crept over her, turning a flicker of worry into a growing fear. Something was not right. Guided by a growing sense of dread, Lisa's intuition drew her through the dimly lit corridors of St. Lucas's church, toward the private rooms where the priest often met with parishioners. The silence pressed heavier with each step, the faint creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet amplifying the tension in the air. Reaching a small, rarely accessed room, Lisa noticed the door slightly ajar, a thin beam of light spilling out and casting jagged shadows onto the stone floor. Hesitating, she pushed the door open, and the scene before her froze her in place. In the flickering light of a dim lamp, she saw a chaotic scattering of books and papers. And there, amidst the disarray, lay the lifeless body of Mona Peterson. Lisa stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as her mind struggled to process the nightmare before her. The grotesque scene seemed ripped from a hellish vision. Mona's body lay savaged, her once gentle and familiar form now twisted and mutilated beyond recognition. Flesh torn, limbs sprawled, blood pooling in obscene streaks across the cold floor. It was a tableau of violence so shocking it threatened to break Lisa's sanity. The first wave of emotion wasn't fear. It was a hollow, gnawing void, as if the fabric of reality had been ripped apart, leaving her untethered in a world she no longer understood. Her hands trembled as her knees threatened to give way, but still, she stood, transfixed by the monstrous sight. When the scream finally tore from her throat, it was raw and primal, yet the church walls absorbed it like a black hole. The sound deadened into a suffocating silence. Time slowed to a crawl, and Lisa's mind grappled with the horrifying truth that slashed through her disbelief. Mona was gone. Her friend, her confidant, was dead, ripped from life in a manner so cruel it felt like an assault on nature itself. And then she saw it. Just beyond the lifeless body, amid the chaos of blood and shattered innocence, lay a cross. Its once pristine surface was smeared with crimson, a macabre defilement of the sacred symbol. Lisa's stomach twisted violently. This wasn't just murder, it was desecration. The sanctity of St. Lucas's church, the place that had always been a haven, was now defiled, dripping with the filth of unspeakable evil. Her legs finally gave out, and she fell to her knees, the metallic tang of blood filling her nostrils as her gaze remained fixed on the cross. Rage and grief churned within her, warring against the paralyzing terror that threatened to consume her. The sanctuary was no longer holy, it was a tomb, a monument to a brutality that would haunt her forever. The police arrived swiftly, their boots clattering against the stone floors, the sound reverberating through the solemn silence of the church. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, but the air was thick with tension as they surveyed the horrific scene. Questions hung heavily in the air, unspoken but unavoidable. Who could carry out such a savage act in a place of worship? And why Mona? Detective Rachel Mills, a seasoned investigator with a reputation for unflinching focus and razor-sharp instincts, took the lead. From the moment she stepped into the room, she sensed this case would be unlike any she'd encountered before. The violence was chilling, yet something about the scene didn't sit right. It was too precise, too deliberate. As she examined the room, certain details leaped out. Despite the brutality inflicted on Mona's body, the surroundings were unnervingly pristine. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no scattered belongings, no evidence of a fight. It was as though Mona had either trusted her killer or been overpowered so quickly she had no chance to resist. Her personal effects remained untouched, eliminating robbery as a motive. Rachel's sharp eyes traced the edges of the crime scene, piecing together the puzzle. The meticulousness, the calculated violence, the confidence, it all pointed to one conclusion. This wasn't random. The killer had known Mona, perhaps intimately, and had executed their plan with cold, unflinching precision. The church, once a sanctuary, now bore the marks of something far darker. A calculated betrayal hidden behind the veil of faith. Detective Rachel Mills pressed on with the investigation, each new detail reinforcing her belief that this was no random act of violence. The murder wasn't just calculated, it was deliberate. He began his investigation by speaking with Mona's family, friends, and acquaintances, piecing together fragments of her life, particularly her final days. Most people described Mona as warm, compassionate, and deeply involved in her faith, but a few hinted at something less visible, a quieter, more introspective side that she kept hidden, even from those closest to her. James's first interrogation brought him face to face with Lisa Carter, the friend who had discovered Mona's body. Lisa was still visibly shaken, struggling to process the horror of what she had seen. Yet, through her shock, she managed to share details that deepened the mystery. In the weeks leading up to her death, Lisa said, Mona had seemed increasingly withdrawn. She often appeared lost in thought and had even begun to avoid discussing church matters, previously one of her favorite topics. What struck James most was Lisa's account of Mona's unusual behavior. Recently, she had started coming to the church late at night, long after services had ended, when the building was empty and quiet. Lisa didn't know why, but something had clearly been weighing on Mona, something she hadn't confided to anyone. As James listened, the pieces of the puzzle began to shift, hinting at a deeper, hidden struggle in Mona's life. The search for answers was just beginning, but one thing was clear. Whatever had driven Mona to the church alone in those final days might be the key to understanding her death and the secrets she had taken to her grave. Rachel, meanwhile, turned her attention to the crime scene, convinced that the key to solving the case might lie in the smallest, seemingly insignificant details. Every shadow, every misplaced object could tell a story. As she meticulously examined the area, Father David McCollins stepped forward, offering to assist. His demeanor was polite, his intentions seemingly genuine, but something about him struck Rachel as off. The priest's composure was unnervingly steady, far too calm for a man who not only knew the victim personally, but had seen her mutilated body. While others had been visibly shaken, Father David's lack of outward distress felt unnatural, as though he were holding something back, or had already come to terms with the horror. It wasn't enough to accuse him of anything. but it was enough to raise Rachel's suspicions. She decided to tread carefully, accepting his help for now while quietly observing his every move. If Father David held any piece of the puzzle, she was determined to uncover it, no matter how deeply it might be buried beneath his calm exterior. Father David McCollins was a man of contradictions. Known for his unwavering faith and stern demeanor, he was both respected and, at times, quietly feared within the community. His sermons often carried a sharpness, with undertones that unsettled some parishioners, even as they nodded along. He was a staunch traditionalist, adhering to church doctrine with an intensity that bordered on rigidity, a quality that could feel more imposing than inspiring. Subtle but undeniable changes in his demeanor were impossible to ignore. Once approachable and warm, Father David grew increasingly withdrawn, avoiding conversations and sidestepping questions. His usual composure seemed frayed, replaced by an unsettling air of distraction, as if he were carrying a heavy burden he couldn't share. Even those who had long revered him as the moral compass of the town began to wonder. Was this simply the weight of grief and responsibility, or was there something darker behind his altered behavior? The whispers grew louder, and the cracks in his once flawless image widened. For the first time, the people of Barrywood began to question whether their trusted leader might be hiding something far more damning than anyone could have imagined. Detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport decided it was time to look beyond Father David McCollins' calm facade. They understood that even the most upright appearances could conceal shadows, and their investigation into his past quickly began to reveal contradictions. David McCollins had been born into a devoutly religious family, raised in an environment of strict discipline and unwavering adherence to faith. From an early age, his life had been shaped by the expectation that he would serve the church. His parents, both rigid and deeply principled, instilled in him a relentless sense of duty and a belief in the absolute authority of religious doctrine. These teachings became the foundation of his character, guiding his every action as he rose through the ranks of the clergy. But as Rachel and James dug deeper, troubling details began to surface. Details that didn't align with his pristine reputation. James uncovered records that revealed Father David had served in another diocese for several years before being assigned to Barrywood. During his time there, his tenure had been far from unblemished. Several parishioners had lodged complaints against him, citing his excessive severity and the harsh methods he employed in disciplining children at the church school. One particular complaint had escalated to the point of an internal investigation. However, the matter had been quietly swept under the rug instead of facing consequences, and David was discreetly transferred to a different parish. This practice left questions unanswered and accountability unaddressed. These revelations cast a new light on Father David for Rachel and James. While they didn't directly connect him to Mona's murder, they painted a picture of a man whose rigid principles and hidden history hinted at complexities far darker than anyone in Barrywood had imagined. The detectives knew they were just scratching the surface, and the deeper they dug, the closer they came to unraveling the truth behind the man who had once been the town's moral compass. Rachel and James felt the growing urgency of their mission. The stakes had become more than solving a murder. They were fighting to restore a semblance of peace and trust in a town teetering on the brink of chaos. But to do that, they needed answers, and they knew those answers lay hidden in the shadows cast by St. Lucas's church and its enigmatic priest. As detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport dug deeper into the investigation, the atmosphere in Barrywood grew more oppressive by the day. The once peaceful town, where neighbors had greeted each other with warmth and trust, now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Suspicion hung in the air, thick and unyielding, as whispers of Mona Peterson's murder and the unsettling suspicions surrounding Father David McCollins consumed the community. The town's heartbeat shifted to a nervous rhythm of rumors and speculation. Simple conversations often spiraled into heated debates, with fingers pointing in all directions. At the local cafe, where residents typically gathered for idle chatter and lighthearted gossip, the murder had become the sole topic of discussion. Tables buzzed with theories, accusations, and fragments of supposed evidence. "I saw Mona near the church that night," one patron claimed, their voice tinged with certainty. Another chimed in, recounting Father David's peculiar behavior in recent weeks. "He's not been himself, always muttering, looking over his shoulder." No detail was too small, no observation too insignificant. Each snippet of information was scrutinized and dissected, woven into a narrative that grew darker with each retelling. People who had once been steadfast in their belief in Father David's innocence now whispered their doubts, while others shifted their suspicion to new targets, creating a web of mistrust that entangled everyone in town. For Rachel and James, this wave of paranoia only added urgency to their work. While the townsfolk speculated and fueled the fire of suspicion, the detectives knew that the truth wouldn't be found in rumors. It lay somewhere in the shadows, waiting for them to uncover it before Barrywood tore itself apart under the weight of fear and uncertainty. One of the most hotly debated topics in Barrywood was the relationship between Mona Peterson and Father David McCollins. Many had known Mona as a devoted member of the church, someone who spent countless hours volunteering, organizing events, and supporting the parish. Her closeness to Father David had always seemed natural, a bond rooted in shared faith and service. But in the wake of her murder, that connection began to take on a more sinister tone in the minds of the townsfolk. Whispers spread quickly, questioning the true nature of their relationship. Was it purely spiritual, or was there something deeper, perhaps even improper? Every interaction between Mona and the priest, once seen as innocent, was now scrutinized under the harsh light of suspicion. Amelia Ross, the church secretary, found herself swept into the growing storm of rumors. As someone who worked alongside Father David daily, she became an unwitting subject of the town's speculation. The villagers wondered what Amelia might know, whether she had noticed any unusual behavior or overheard something that could shed light on Mona's death. Some claimed that Amelia must have turned a blind eye to the priest's actions, while others whispered that she might have been complicit in keeping secrets from the community. Her every movement, every word, became fodder for gossip, and her previously respected role in the church was now tinged with doubt. For Amelia, the mounting pressure was unbearable. She found herself caught between her loyalty to Father David and the growing unease that gnawed at her. The villagers' relentless scrutiny only added to the tension, threatening to pull her into the same web of suspicion that had ensnared the priest. And yet, deep down, Amelia began to question whether she had overlooked something critical, something that could unravel the truth behind Mona's tragic end. The townsfolk's suspicions extended beyond idle gossip. Some began to believe that Amelia Ross, the church secretary, might know more than she let on. Her silence, coupled with her close proximity to Father David and her intimate knowledge of the parish's internal workings, made her a target of speculation. Whispers even suggested that Amelia could have been involved in the murder, fueling an already volatile atmosphere. Detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport recognized the destructive potential of unchecked rumors. While public interest in the case could lead to valuable tips, the rampant gossip threatened to complicate their investigation by creating unnecessary distractions and deepening divisions in the community. Determined to address this, they organized a series of meetings with residents, both to gather first-hand accounts and to quell the rising tensions. At one of these gatherings, they encountered John Miller, a persistent local journalist who had been shadowing the investigation from the start. John had a knack for uncovering details and a penchant for sharing his theories with anyone willing to listen. He was convinced that the case was far more complex than a crime of jealousy or revenge. In hushed tones, he floated the idea that Mona's murder might be connected to dark rituals or ancient rites, hinting that Father David might have been involved in something far more sinister than anyone suspected. Rachel, though skeptical of his more outlandish theories, saw potential value in John's network of contacts. As a journalist, he often interacted with people who might be too wary or intimidated to speak directly to the police. His insights, while speculative, could lead to useful threads to follow. Tony decided to keep an open mind, taking note of his suggestions even as she prioritized more tangible leads. She knew that amidst the wild conjecture, there could be a grain of truth waiting to be uncovered. The most unexpected consequence of the investigation was the crisis of faith that began to take root among Barrywood's most devoted parishioners. The idea that Father David, someone they had trusted with their deepest fears, hopes, and confessions, could be connected to such a horrific crime shook them to their core. For many, the priest was more than a spiritual leader. He was the cornerstone of their belief system. Now, doubts seeped into their hearts, unraveling the foundations of faith upon which their lives had been built. Amid this turmoil, Lisa Carter, one of Mona's closest friends, stood as a rare voice of support for Father David. Unlike the majority of the town, Lisa remained steadfast in her belief in his innocence, but her loyalty came at a price. The same neighbors who once shared meals and laughter with her now looked at her with suspicion and disdain. They whispered that her defense of the priest was either born of denial or evidence that she knew more than she was letting on. Lisa quickly became an object of alienation. Conversations grew cold when she approached, and doors that were once open to her now stayed firmly shut. Her faith in Father David, once a shared conviction among the parishioners, now seemed inexplicable, even absurd, to those who had already judged him guilty. The isolation weighed heavily on Lisa, but she refused to waver. Her unwavering support only deepened the suspicions around her, with some even questioning whether she might be hiding something about Mona's death. As the town's fractures widened, Lisa found herself caught in a storm of doubt, her once close community now a place of loneliness and quiet accusations. Her resilience, however, hinted at a deeper truth, one that Rachel and James could not afford to overlook. Rachel and James could feel the pressure mounting as Barrywood spiraled deeper into chaos. The town's fractures, once manageable whispers and rumors, now threatened to erupt into something far more volatile. The detectives realized they needed answers, and they needed them quickly. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more the community unraveled under the weight of suspicion and fear. Determined to regain control, Rachel and James doubled down on their efforts, scrutinizing every shred of evidence with renewed focus. They re-examined witness statements, retraced Mona's final steps, and meticulously combed through the forensic reports for anything they might have overlooked. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seemed, was revisited with fresh eyes. Rachel focused on deciphering Mona's diary, hoping that its cryptic entries might hold the key to understanding her fears and her connection to Father David. Meanwhile, James worked to verify the timelines and alibis of everyone involved, chasing down leads that had previously seemed inconsequential. They also extended their outreach, speaking to anyone who might have seen or heard something, even those who had been reluctant to come forward before. The urgency of their work wasn't just about solving the murder. It was about preventing Barrywood from imploding under the weight of its own suspicions. The detectives knew that breaking the case open wouldn't just bring justice for Mona. It was the only way to restore peace to a community teetering on the brink of collapse. Every passing hour felt like a race against time, and they were determined to uncover the truth before the darkness consuming Barrywood became irreversible, slipping just out of reach as the puzzle grew ever more intricate. For Rachel and James, the stakes had never been higher, and the line between clarity and chaos had never felt thinner. One of the major hurdles in the investigation was the growing inconsistency in witness testimonies. Some residents claimed they had seen Mona and Father David together on the evening before her death, while others insisted that the priest had already left the church when Mona arrived. Rachel understood that memory could be unreliable, especially under stress, but the sheer number of conflicting accounts raised a red flag. It wasn't just a matter of errors. Something about the discrepancies felt deliberate, as if the truth was being obscured. James, sensing they might have overlooked something crucial, decided to revisit the evidence from the crime scene. Carefully combing through the reports and physical items, he noticed details that had been dismissed during the initial investigation. One key discovery stood out: the fingerprints on the knives and the bloodied cross used in the murder. Initially, it had been assumed that the prints belonged solely to Mona and Father David, given their known proximity to the church, but a re-examination revealed something startling. There were prints from a third party, someone whose identity remained unknown. These prints didn't match any of the known suspects, nor did they belong to any of the townsfolk who had been questioned. The realization was a breakthrough, but also deepened the mystery. If someone else had been present at the scene, it meant there was a hidden element in the case, a person operating in the shadows, whose motives and connections remained unclear. This revelation sent a jolt through the investigation. Rachel and James knew they were no longer dealing with just one suspect, but potentially a far more intricate web of deception, where each answer only led to more questions. The true killer, it seemed, was closer than they had thought, yet still shrouded in darkness. The discovery of the unidentified fingerprints cast serious doubt on the theory that Father David had acted alone, or even that he was the true killer. The possibility of an accomplice, or another individual entirely, began to take shape, further complicating the case. For Tony, this revelation underscored the need to re-examine every aspect of the investigation, starting with Father David's alibi. Rachel revisited the testimonies of parishioners who claimed to have seen the priest on the night of the murder. Among them was Henry Wallace, an elderly man who had been adamant in his initial statement that Father David was at the church during the critical time. However, under careful questioning, Henry faltered. With a heavy sigh, he confessed that he wasn't certain if he had actually seen the priest that evening. Henry admitted that his earlier statement had been influenced by pressure from other parishioners, many of whom were desperate to preserve their faith in Father David's innocence. The idea that their trusted spiritual leader could be involved in such a horrific crime had been too much for them to bear, and Henry had gone along with the narrative out of loyalty and fear of ostracism. Controversial real estate deals involving church-owned land. While this could explain the mysterious funds, it didn't clarify how these transactions tied to Mona, or why they might have led to her death. The evidence only seemed to grow more tangled. With every piece of information, the list of questions expanded. What role, if any, had the money played in Mona's murder? Was it possible that she had uncovered something about these transactions? And who else might have been involved? Rachel and James began to suspect they were dealing with something far more significant than a personal conflict or crime of passion. The patterns emerging hinted at a larger conspiracy, possibly involving multiple individuals with intersecting motives. Each piece of the puzzle suggested that Mona's death was not an isolated act, but the result of a broader scheme in which she had become an obstacle, one that someone, or perhaps several people, had decided to remove. As the detectives worked to untangle the connections between the financial irregularities, Father David's past dealings, and Mona's murder, they knew time was against them. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this case was far more insidious than it initially seemed, and the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. The once close-knit town of Barrywood was unraveling, its foundations shaken by fear and suspicion. As every new revelation emerged, the anxiety in the community deepened. People no longer knew who to trust. Neighbors who had once shared meals and confidences now eyed each other with suspicion, and the town fragmented into groups, each clinging to its own theories and pointing fingers. The fabric of unity that had defined Barrywood was quickly fraying. For detectives Rachel Mills and James Davenport, the stakes couldn't have been higher. Time was slipping away, and the escalating tension threatened to spiral into chaos if they couldn't find answers soon. Yet, the deeper they delved into the investigation, the more labyrinthine it became. This wasn't a simple crime born of passion or impulse. It was something far more calculated, layered with hidden agendas and long-buried secrets. As the investigation reached a critical juncture, Rachel and James began to uncover a grim realization. Mona Peterson's death wasn't an isolated act of violence. The evidence pointed to a web of ulterior motives and complex intrigues, woven into the lives of people who, on the surface, had seemed untouchable. Behind the polished facades of trust and virtue lay darker truths, secrets that connected Father David, the church, and perhaps even others in the community, to a conspiracy that was far more dangerous than they had initially imagined. Each piece of evidence revealed another thread in a tangled web of deception, power, and betrayal. What had begun as a single murder investigation now appeared to be the tip of an iceberg threatening to drag Barrywood into even darker waters. Rachel and James knew they were racing against time, not only to solve the case but to prevent the fragile town from being torn apart by the shadows of its own secrets. Opened up, she admitted that she had long harbored suspicions about Father David's connections, particularly his relationship with the woman tied to the letters. Amelia had noticed financial irregularities and the priest's occasional, unexplained absences, but fear had kept her silent. Amelia explained that her job and standing in the community depended on her loyalty to the church and Father David. Speaking out could have cost her everything. "I didn't want to believe it," she said, her voice trembling. "I convinced myself it was none of my business. But Mona might have known something I didn't." She wasn't afraid to ask questions. Her confession added weight to the theory that Mona's murder was more than a crime of passion or revenge. Rachel and James now faced the daunting task of untangling a web of secrets, lies, and alliances that extended far beyond Father David. The stakes were higher than ever, as it became clear that multiple people might have had reasons to keep Mona's discoveries buried, and that uncovering the truth could put the detectives themselves in danger. Amelia revealed a crucial detail that added another layer to the unfolding mystery. She confessed that in the months leading up to her death, Mona had frequently asked pointed questions about the church's finances, specifically where the money was going. Mona's inquiries had grown more persistent, and while she never shared her conclusions, it was clear she suspected something was amiss. Amelia also recalled Mona's final visit, just days before her death. Mona had seemed deeply anxious, confiding that she needed to speak with Father David urgently. She didn't elaborate on the matter, but her demeanor suggested that whatever she had discovered weighed heavily on her. Amelia then shared an observation that sent a chill through Rachel and James. On the day Mona was killed, she had seen an unfamiliar man leaving the church. He was dressed in dark clothes and moved in a way that seemed calculated to avoid attention. At the time, Amelia hadn't thought much of it, but now the memory felt ominous. Could this man be the third person Mona had referenced in her diary? The one who tried to dissuade her from acting? Rachel and James immediately decided to investigate further, focusing on identifying this mysterious figure. They combed through CCTV footage from around the church and managed to find a clip from the evening of the murder. The footage showed a man in dark clothing entering the church. Although his face was obscured, his behavior was telling. He moved with deliberate caution, as if he knew he was being watched or anticipated the need to avoid detection. This discovery brought the detectives closer to uncovering the truth. If this man was the third person Mona had mentioned, he could hold the key to understanding her final hours and the motives behind her murder. But his identity remained elusive, and Rachel and James knew that finding him was now a top priority. They were on the verge of a breakthrough, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous the case became. Orchestrated Mona's murder. The timing of the meeting and the apparent intensity of the exchange suggested that whatever they discussed was pivotal. The detectives knew they were on the brink of uncovering the truth. The next step was clear: identify the mysterious man and determine what had transpired in that clandestine meeting. As the pieces of the puzzle began to align, Rachel and James felt the weight of the case more heavily than ever. They weren't just racing to solve Mona's murder, they were fighting to prevent the killer from striking again and to restore a sense of safety to a town teetering on the edge of chaos. The case took a decisive turn as Rachel and James connected Father David to the mysterious man seen on the church's surveillance footage. It was now clear that the priest not only knew the man, but had likely been complicit in his actions. While Rachel focused on identifying the suspect, James dug deeper into Father David's father's financial records. He uncovered a series of suspicious transactions involving large sums of money transferred to an account registered to someone named Stephen Fletcher. The name was unfamiliar to the detectives, but further investigation revealed that Fletcher was a private investigator with a notorious reputation for doing dirty work for clients who wanted to remain in the shadows. Rachel pieced the puzzle together. Stephen Fletcher was almost certainly the man seen meeting Father David at the church on the night of Mona's murder. All evidence pointed to the priest hiring Fletcher to silence Mona, who had become a threat to his secrets. Determined to track Fletcher down, the detectives began searching for his whereabouts. Their efforts paid off when they located him at a small motel on the outskirts of a nearby town. Wasting no time, Rachel and James drove to the location with a plan to detain Fletcher and compel him to confess his role in the crime. When they arrived, Fletcher attempted to flee, but he couldn't outrun the determined detectives. After a brief chase, he was apprehended and taken into custody. Faced with mounting evidence and relentless questioning, Fletcher eventually broke under pressure. He confessed that Father David had hired him to intimidate Mona into silence. The priest was convinced that Mona had discovered his illegitimate child and the illegal financial dealings he had tried so hard to conceal. Fearing that she planned to expose these secrets, which would destroy his career and reputation, Father David sought an extreme solution. According to Fletcher, the situation escalated unexpectedly. Mona, realizing her life was in danger, had tried to flee during their confrontation. In a moment of panic, Fletcher killed her. His account confirmed the detective's suspicions and painted a harrowing picture of desperation, betrayal, and a fatal attempt to cover up the truth. With Fletcher's confession, Rachel and James finally had the necessary pieces to close the case. The shocking revelations implicated Father David and exposed the web of lies and corruption that had stained the town's sanctity. Barrywood would never be the same, but justice for Mona Peterson was finally within reach. Throughout the trial, Father David maintained an unsettling silence. He sat stoically, showing no visible emotion as the accusations piled up. Only once did he break this silence, when his defense attorney attempted to frame him as a victim of circumstance. Rising abruptly, Father David stated, in a cold and detached tone, that he was prepared to accept his fate. The brief confession lacked any hint of remorse or regret, as though he had resigned himself to the collapse of his world. After weeks of gripping testimony and exhaustive arguments, the jury reached its decision. Father David McCollins was found guilty on all charges, including conspiracy to commit murder, financial fraud, and obstruction of justice. The sentence was severe: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict sent shockwaves through Barrywood. For those who had clung to the belief in Father David's innocence, the reality was almost too much to bear. The man they had once trusted with their faith and confessions was now unmasked as a manipulator and murderer. For others, the verdict was a long overdue reckoning, a harsh but necessary moment of justice for Mona Peterson and the truth she had died to uncover. The trial became a turning point in Barrywood's history, a moment that shattered the town's illusion of sanctity and exposed the dark secrets lurking beneath its serene surface. The community was left to grapple with the aftermath, struggling to rebuild trust and faith in the wake of such a profound betrayal. For many, the events surrounding Father David's trial were a painful reminder that even the most revered figures could harbor unspeakable sins, and that the truth, no matter how devastating, could never be silenced. Rachel Mills and James Davenport, after months of relentless pursuit, finally felt the weight of the case lift. They had delivered justice for Mona Peterson, but the sense of accomplishment was tempered by the emotional toll the investigation had taken on them. For Rachel, who had always prided herself on her objectivity and professionalism, the case was a sobering reminder that some truths, no matter how necessary, could leave lasting scars. James, on the other hand, was profoundly struck by how easily trust and faith, foundations of a community, could crumble under the weight of betrayal. Barrywood was forever changed in the aftermath of the trial. St. Lucas's church, once the heart of the town, now stood abandoned, its grandeur tarnished by the dark revelations surrounding Father David. Many parishioners stopped attending altogether, unable to reconcile their faith with the priest's heinous acts. Those who remained clung to their belief, but the atmosphere was heavy with a sense of betrayal and disillusionment. The once close-knit community was fractured, split between those desperate to move on and those unable to let go of the painful memories. Lisa Carter, Mona's closest friend, bore her own burden of guilt and sorrow. She couldn't forgive herself for failing to see the darkness in Father David, even when the evidence had become overwhelming. The loss of Mona and the collapse of her faith in someone she had trusted so deeply left her feeling hollow, unable to face the lingering shadows of the tragedy, consequences of hidden truths. From that point forward, they approached every case with heightened vigilance, fully aware that beneath even the smallest lie could lurk far greater darkness than anyone imagined. The story of Barrywood, the murder of Mona Peterson, the trial of Father David McCollins, and the unraveling of the town's faith had come to an end, but its impact would ripple through the community for years to come. The memory of the tragedy became a haunting reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how easily evil can hide in plain sight, cloaked in the guise of righteousness. Yet, out of the ashes of betrayal came a powerful lesson. Barrywood learned, however painfully, that the truth must always be pursued, no matter how bitter or uncomfortable it may be. Evil thrives in secrecy, and it is only through uncovering and confronting it that healing and justice can be achieved. For Rachel, James, and the people of Barrywood, the scars of the past remained, but so did a commitment to vigilance and accountability. The story was over, but its legacy served as a reminder of the importance of courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth, even in the face of darkness. Thank you for enjoying Silent Shadows. Stay tuned for more exciting episodes, and as always, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. youtube.com/GravePitShadows.